The acrid fist of smoke, thick and black, punched through the cold night air, carrying with it the panicked shouts and the terrifying, unmistakable roar of an uncontrolled blaze. Chief Federal Fire Investigator Alex Ramsey stood on the hastily established perimeter, the flashing red and blue lights of responding emergency vehicles painting grotesque dancing shadows on the facade of the inferno that had once been Valor House, a community shelter for disabled veterans. Flames greedy and orange clawed at the sky, devouring the old wooden structure with a relentless hunger. Windows exploded outwards, showering the already debris-strewn lawn with glittering shards of glass. The heat was a palpable force, pushing against him, even from this distance, carrying the sickeningly sweet smell of burning old wood insulation and something else, something chemical and sharp, that his finely honed senses immediately flagged as an anomaly. This was no ordinary accidental fire. He knew it in his gut, with the same certainty that told him which way a fire would turn, how a structure would collapse. This fire had an architect. He'd been in Oakhaven for a regional fire safety summit, a rather dull affair of PowerPoint presentations and lukewarm coffee, a necessary evil in his line of work. He was due to give the keynote address the next morning on advanced arson detection techniques. The irony was not lost on him as he watched Valor House burn. His presence here was a grim coincidence, or perhaps he thought a grim inevitability. The call had come through to the local fire chief, a decent but overwhelmed man named Henderson, who upon hearing of Alex's presence in town had made the immediate slightly panicked request for him to attend the scene. "It's bad, Ramsey," Henderson had said over the crackling radio, his voice tight with strain. "Real bad, and it went up like a damn torch." Like a torch. Alex filed that away. That meant accelerant. Lots of it. He saw figures huddled on the grass verge opposite the burning building wrapped in blankets, their faces illuminated by the terrible light etched with shock and a weary familiar trauma. Veterans. Men and women who had already seen too much fire, too much destruction in their lives. Now their sanctuary was being consumed before their eyes. A wave of cold anger, tightly controlled, began to build beneath Alex's professional composure. He was 52, lean and weathered, with eyes the color of storm clouds that had witnessed the aftermath of countless tragedies, from catastrophic industrial blazes to the quiet devastation of single-family homes deliberately set alight. A 20-year veteran of the Army Corps of Engineers, before joining the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and then rising to lead its Federal Fire Investigation Unit, Alex Ramsey understood fire intimately. Its physics, its chemistry, its capacity for obliteration, and the dark recesses of the human hearts that sometimes chose to wield it as a weapon. Valor House was not just a building. It was a symbol, and its destruction felt like a desecration. He watched as firefighters, dwarfed by the inferno, battled to contain the blaze, their streams of water looking like futile gestures against the raging conflagration. One wing of the U-shaped building was already starting to collapse inwards, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the night sky. David Chen, the shelter manager, a man Alex had met briefly at a town fundraising event a few months prior when he'd been scouting locations for a new ATF regional training center, stood near the command post, his face pale, his movements jerky, as he tried to account for all his residents. Alex approached him. "David," Alex said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "Alex Ramsey, are all your people out?" Chen jumped, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Alex, Chief Ramsey, yes, I think so. Frank, Sergeant Major Washington is doing a head count, but it happened so fast, so fast." His voice cracked. "They were asleep, most of them." "Oh, any idea how it started?" Alex asked, though he already had his suspicions. Chen shook his head, tears welling. "No, we had an inspection just last month. Wiring was old, but they said it was acceptable. We were fundraising for upgrades." He gestured vaguely at the burning building. This is not just old wiring." No, Alex thought it wasn't. He saw Sergeant Major Frank Washington, a tall, dignified African-American man in his late 70s, his face a mask of grim resolve, moving among the displaced veterans, his arm around the shoulder of a young woman who was sobbing uncontrollably. Frank was a legend in the local veteran community, a decorated hero from 2 wars, the moral compass of Valor House. If anyone knew the pulse of this place, it was him. Alex's gaze swept the perimeter, noting the pattern of the burn, the intense heat localized in several areas, the way the flames had spread with unnatural speed. This wasn't just arson. This was professional-grade malice, or at least malice with access to the right materials and a reckless disregard for human life. His mind was already working, sifting through possibilities, formulating a plan of investigation. He would let the local teams extinguish the blaze, secure the scene. Then his work would truly begin. The keynote address on arson detection would have to wait. He had a real-life, horrifyingly vivid demonstration to dissect. The town of Oak Haven was on its surface idyllic. Tree-lined streets, historic Victorian homes, a prosperous downtown area with quaint boutiques and artisanal coffee shops. But like many such towns, it had its undercurrents. Valor House, situated in a sprawling, slightly neglected older building on the edge of the more affluent residential district, had been a point of contention for some time. It provided much-needed housing and support services for about 30 disabled veterans, men and women struggling with physical injuries, PTSD, and the difficult transition back to civilian life. Most of Oak Haven's residents supported Valor House, recognizing the debt owed to these individuals. But a vocal, influential minority led by one Brenda Voorhees had been campaigning tirelessly for its relocation. Brenda Voorhees was a name that had come up in Alex's peripheral awareness during his training center scouting. She was the chairperson of the Oak Haven Preservation Alliance, a powerful local lobby group ostensibly dedicated to maintaining the town's historic character, but more often it seemed dedicated to maintaining high property values and a certain exclusionary aesthetic. Voorhees, a wealthy widow in her late 50s, with a perfectly coiffed silver mane and an air of unshakable self-importance, had made no secret of her disdain for Valor House. She'd called it an eyesore, complained about unpredictable elements it brought into the neighborhood, and had frequently publicly lamented its supposed negative impact on local real estate. Her arguments were always couched in terms of community standards and fiscal responsibility, but the underlying message of NIMBYism and prejudice was clear to anyone willing to see it. Alex remembered a particularly acrimonious town council meeting he'd inadvertently witnessed, streamed online a few weeks ago while researching local dynamics. Brenda Voorhees, elegant in a Chanel suit, had been icily furious as the council voted down her latest petition to have Valor House's zoning reviewed. Her carefully constructed composure had slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of vindictive anger that had been quite startling. This council will rue the day it prioritized sentimentality over the clear documented concerns of tax-paying homeowners. She had hissed her voice low and venomous before stalking from the chamber. Alex had made a mental note of her, then a woman capable of intense, calculated malice. Now standing before the burning ruin of the very shelter she had vowed to fight, that memory resurfaced with chilling clarity. The first gray light of dawn was painting the sky when the last of the major flames were finally subdued, leaving behind a steaming, blackened skeleton of what was once Valor House. The air was thick with the stench of wet ash, charred wood, and despair. The displaced veterans had been moved to a temporary shelter at the local high school gymnasium, a stark and uncomfortable refuge. Alex, after a brief grim conversation with Fire Chief Henderson and the local police chief, had officially taken the lead on the investigation, citing the distinct possibility of arson and the federal interest due to the shelter's funding and the victims involved. His federal credentials, quietly presented, had cut through any potential jurisdictional squabbles. He was now standing in the cold, damp morning air, his boots crunching on charred debris, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an expert's critical eye. This was his church, his laboratory, the place where the dead and the destroyed told their secrets to those who knew how to listen. His team, small and highly specialized, was already en route from Quantico. In the meantime, he began his preliminary walkthrough with Henderson. The signs were depressingly familiar to him. The alligator charring on the wooden beams in several distinct separate locations indicated multiple points of origin. The way the flooring had burned through in certain spots suggested pooled accelerant. He found the faint, telltale odor of gasoline lingering beneath the overwhelming smell of smoke in a less damaged section of the rear wing, an area that suspiciously seemed to be one of the ignition points. "She went up like a Roman candle, Alex," Henderson said, shaking his head, his face smudged with soot and fatigue. We've had small fires here before, kitchen stuff, an old space heater once. Nothing like this. This was meant to destroy, utterly. It was, Alex agreed, his voice grim, and it was meant to do it quickly. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, or they were incredibly lucky with their ignorance. He knelt, examining a melted plastic container near what looked like a deliberately breached window at ground level. Its shape was distorted, but he could make out the remnants of a label, a common brand of solvent, highly flammable. He spent the morning interviewing the residents, starting with David Chen and Frank Washington. Chen was distraught, guilt-ridden, convinced he should have done more to protect his people, despite the impossibility of predicting such an attack. Frank Washington was a different story. His grief was palpable, but beneath it was a core of tempered steel. He sat straight-backed on a folding chair in the noisy gymnasium, his hands clasped, his gaze direct. Chief Ramsey. Frank began, his voice a low rumble. We've made enemies in this town, or rather, one very powerful enemy who has her followers. Brenda Voorhees. Alex stated, not as a question. Frank nodded slowly. She's been trying to shut us down for years. Petitions, lawsuits, zoning challenges, complaints to the health department about imaginary infestations. You name it, she's tried it. Called us eyesores, dangers to the community. Said we didn't fit the Oakhaven image. His lip curled slightly. The image she wants, that is. Pristine, wealthy, and untroubled by the sight of men and women who sacrificed for this country and came back, changed. Did she ever make direct threats? Alex asked. Not in so many words, Frank admitted. She's too smart for that. It was always veiled. It would be a shame if something unfortunate were to happen to this property, or this situation simply cannot be allowed to continue indefinitely. That kind of talk. But the malice was there. You could feel it coming off her in waves. Another veteran, Maria Sanchez, a young woman who walked with a pronounced limp and whose hands trembled constantly from PTSD, spoke up from nearby, her voice barely above a whisper. Last week, someone spray-painted "Get Out Freaks" on our back fence. We painted over it, didn't report it. Figured it would just give her more ammunition, another incident to complain about. Alex felt that cold anger stir again. This wasn't just about property. This was about hate. Brenda Voorhees, when Alex and a local detective went to inform her of the fire and ask some preliminary questions later that morning, was the picture of concerned civic leadership. She opened the door of her immaculate multi-million-dollar Victorian home herself, dressed in tasteful mourning dove gray, her expression carefully arranged into one of shocked sympathy. Chief Ramsey, Detective Miller. She said, her voice modulated to convey just the right amount of distress. This is simply devastating news. Those poor veterans. Is everyone all right? All residents were evacuated, Ms. Voorhees. Alex said, his face unreadable, though the shelter itself is a total loss. A tragedy, she murmured, shaking her head, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be unshed tears. An absolute tragedy. That old building, I always worried about its safety. The wiring, you know. It was a tinderbox waiting to happen. The initial assessment suggests the fire may not have been accidental, Ms. Voorhees, Alex stated, watching her closely. A perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose. Not accidental, you mean arson? She pressed a hand to her chest. But who would do such a monstrous thing, targeting disabled veterans? It's unthinkable. We're exploring all possibilities, Alex said. You've been quite vocal in your opposition to Valor House. Can you tell us about that? Brenda Voorhees stiffened slightly, her carefully crafted sympathy faltering for a microsecond. My concerns, Chief Ramsey, were always about zoning compliance, public safety standards, and the financial burden on the town for services. Legitimate concerns shared by many homeowners in Oakhaven. It had nothing to do with the veterans themselves, whom I deeply respect. To suggest otherwise, or to imply any connection between my civic activism and this horrific act, would be slanderous. Her voice had regained its icy edge. Of course, Alex said smoothly. We're just trying to understand the full context. Were you at home last night, Ms. Voorhees? She met his gaze coolly. I was. A quiet evening. Reading. I retired early. My housekeeper can confirm I was here all night. Not that I should need to provide an alibi for a crime I find utterly reprehensible. Just routine questions, Ms. Voorhees. The local detective interjected a little too quickly. Alex noted his deference to her. Clearly, Brenda Voorhees wielded considerable influence. As they left, Alex knew he had his prime suspect. Her denial was too polished, her shock too theatrical. And her mention of wiring, before he'd even hinted at a cause, was a classic overplay, an attempt to steer the narrative. She was smart, connected, and ruthless. This would not be an easy investigation. The next few days were a whirlwind of forensic analysis, witness interviews, and navigating the complex social and political landscape of Oak Haven. Alex's team arrived setting up a mobile command unit near the ruins of Valor House. They meticulously sifted through the charred remains, cataloging evidence, taking samples for lab analysis. The presence of gasoline and a commercial-grade solvent used as an accelerant was quickly confirmed in multiple locations. The fire had indeed been deliberately set with an intent to cause maximum rapid destruction. The displaced veterans housed in the increasingly stuffy and demoralizing gymnasium were growing restless and anxious. David Chen was working frantically with state agencies to find more suitable temporary housing, but options were limited. The community of Oak Haven was divided. While many expressed outrage and sympathy, organizing donation drives for the veterans, a vocal contingent undoubtedly influenced by Brenda Voorhees and her allies began to whisper that perhaps the fire was a blessing, in disguise a chance to finally rid the town of the problematic shelter. Anonymous, hateful comments appeared on online news articles about the fire. Brenda Voorhees, meanwhile, was conducting a masterclass in public relations. She announced a significant personal donation to the Valor House Relief Fund, a fund she herself had helped establish through one of her charitable foundations, Alex noted with cynicism. She gave interviews to local media expressing her profound sorrow and calling for unity, all while subtly reinforcing the narrative that the old building had been a fire trap and that perhaps a new, smaller, more appropriately located shelter should be considered in the future, far from the residential heart of Oak Haven. Alex felt the pressure mounting. He needed a breakthrough, something concrete to cut through Voorhees's carefully constructed facade. He focused on her alibi. The housekeeper, a nervous woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, confirmed that Ms. Voorhees had been home. But when pressed, she admitted she hadn't actually seen her employer after 9 p.m., as she herself retired to her own quarters in a separate wing of the large house. It was possible, though difficult, for Voorhees to have slipped out unnoticed. The first small crack in Brenda's armor came from an unexpected source. A young man who lived a few streets away from Valor House, an amateur astrophotographer, came forward. He'd been out late in his backyard the night of the fire, trying to capture images of a meteor shower. His camera set for long exposures had inadvertently captured a grainy image of a dark-colored luxury SUV, similar to the one Brenda Voorhees drove, moving slowly down the service alley behind Valor House about an hour before the fire was reported. The license plate wasn't visible, and the image was far from conclusive, but it was something. Then a member of Alex's team, painstakingly reviewing security footage from businesses along the main routes leading away from Valor House, found a clearer shot of the same SUV, captured about 30 minutes after the estimated time of ignition, heading away from the area at a considerable speed. The image was clear enough to positively identify the license plate. It was Brenda Voorhees's vehicle. When confronted with this evidence, Brenda didn't flinch. "Yes, that's my car," she admitted coolly. "I suffer from insomnia occasionally. I went for a drive to clear my head. I often do. I may have driven past that area. I wasn't paying particular attention to the route. It means nothing." Her arrogance was astounding, but Alex knew he was getting closer. Her story was plausible, but the timing was incredibly suspicious. The real problem was the direct evidence linking her to the arson itself. The accelerants were common. No witnesses had seen her at the immediate scene. She was too careful for that. Alex suspected she might have used a proxy, someone she could control or blackmail. He began to dig into her known associates, her employees, anyone who might have a motive to do her dirty work. Meanwhile, the plight of the veterans was worsening. The gymnasium was not a sustainable solution. Several of the older or more fragile veterans were experiencing health issues due to the stress and inadequate conditions. Frank Washington's stoicism was beginning to show cracks of deep worry. "My people are suffering, Chief Ramsey," he told Alex during one of their conversations. "They've been through hell overseas only to come home to this. We need justice, yes, but we also need a safe place to live. And soon. Brenda Voorhees then played her next card, a move of stunning cruelty disguised as civic concern. She used her influence on the town council of which she was not a member, but over which she held considerable sway through donations and political maneuvering to block a proposal to temporarily house the Valor House veterans in a vacant municipally owned building on the outskirts of town. Her argument, presented through her allies on the council, was that the building wasn't zoned for residential use and that rushing the process would set a dangerous precedent. It was a transparent attempt to make the veterans so uncomfortable, so desperate, that they would accept any offer to be moved out of Oak Haven entirely. This, Alex recognized, was the first of the truly shocking acts of coercion and deprivation of rights. She was actively working to make these vulnerable individuals homeless and drive them from the community, all while publicly feigning sympathy. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Alex decided it was time to escalate. He'd been gathering his evidence quietly, allowing Brenda to believe she was in control of the narrative, perhaps even outsmarting the investigators. He knew local law enforcement, while cooperative, was still somewhat intimidated by her status and wealth. He needed to shift the entire dynamic. He arranged a meeting at the temporary EOC, ostensibly a routine update for Fire Chief Henderson and Police Chief Miller. He also requested Brenda Voorhees' presence through her lawyer, stating he had some final clarifying questions regarding her vehicle's presence near the scene. She agreed, likely assuming it was a chance to further solidify her alibi or even intimidate him with her legal representation. She swept into the cramped EOC trailer like royalty, visiting the scullery her expensive lawyer, a slick city type named Harrison, by her side. She exuded confidence, a faint condescending smile playing on her lips. Henderson and Miller looked uncomfortable. Alex began calmly recapping the evidence of arson, the type of accelerants used, the timeline. He then presented the images of her SUV. Ms. Voorhees, you stated you were out for a drive due to insomnia. Can you be more specific about your route that night? She repeated her vague story, her lawyer occasionally interjecting with objections about relevance. Alex listened patiently. Then he laid another piece of evidence on the table, a receipt from a hardware store on the outskirts of a neighboring town, dated 2 days before the fire. It was for the purchase of 2 large containers of the specific brand of industrial solvent found at the scene, along with heavy-duty gloves and funnels. The purchase had been made with a credit card, a corporate card belonging to a shell company that Alex's financial forensic team had meticulously traced back to Brenda Voorhees. Brenda's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A tiny muscle twitched in her jaw. Harrison, the lawyer, leaned forward. This is outrageous. That receipt proves nothing. Anyone could have used that card if it even is connected to my client, which we do not concede. The store has security footage of the purchaser, Mr. Harrison. Alex said, his voice still even. A woman heavily disguised in a scarf and large sunglasses, but whose height, build, and distinctive designer handbag are a remarkably close match to Ms. Voorhees. A handbag identical to the one she is carrying right now. Brenda's hand instinctively went to the expensive leather bag on her lap. Her composure finally cracked. A flush rose on her neck. This is a fabrication. A desperate attempt to smear me because of my principled stand on community standards. Is it Ms. Voorhees? Alex leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. The moment had come. Because my team also found something else. Your principled stand appears to have involved more than just petitions. We have a witness, a disgruntled former employee of your landscaping company, who claims you tasked him with discouraging the veterans. He says you offered him a substantial bonus if Valor House were to become uninhabitable. He initially refused, but he kept the recordings of your rather explicit suggestions. This was a slight bluff. The witness was still shaky, the recordings not yet fully authenticated, but it was designed to provoke. Brenda shot to her feet. This is an outrage. I will not be subjected to these wild, unsubstantiated accusations. Harrison, we are leaving. Sit down, Ms. Voorhees. Alex's voice was suddenly like whip crack. The geniality was gone, replaced by an authority that filled the small trailer. You're not going anywhere. He paused, letting the silence stretch his gaze unwavering. Local chiefs Henderson and Miller looked on, stunned by the shift in tone. You see, you and Mr. Harrison seem to be under a slight misapprehension about who I am and why I'm here. You think I'm just another local investigator you can bully or buy off or tie up in legal knots with your high-priced lawyer." He reached into his jacket and slowly, deliberately placed his official badge and credentials on the table. The gold eagle seemed to gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I am Chief Federal Fire Investigator Alex Ramsey of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, United States Department of Justice. The fire at Valor House, a facility receiving federal assistance in housing protected veterans, is being investigated as a federal crime of arson under Title 18, Section 844 of the United States Code. Furthermore, given your concerted efforts to obstruct this investigation, your attempts to intimidate witnesses, and your campaign to deprive these veterans of their right to shelter, we are also investigating potential charges of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. This is no longer a local matter, Ms. Voorhees. This is a federal investigation. And you," he added, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "are my prime suspect, and your little charade is over." Brenda Voorhees stared at the badge, then at Alex's face. All color drained from hers. The condescending smile was gone, replaced by a mask of dawning horror. Her lawyer, Harrison, looked equally stunned, his expensive suit suddenly seeming ill-fitting. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly inverted. She had been playing chess with a pawn, only to discover it was the king. The aftermath of Alex's revelation was swift and decisive. Police Chief Miller, snapping out of his shock, immediately became rigidly formal and cooperative, offering any and all resources of the Oak Haven PD to the federal investigation. Fire Chief Henderson, relieved to have the weight of the case lifted from his shoulders and placed into more capable hands, offered his full support. Brenda Voorhees, visibly shaken, was strongly advised by her chastened lawyer to cooperate fully, though she maintained her innocence, her voice now thin and reedy. Alex pressed his advantage. With federal warrants, his team conducted a thorough search of Brenda's home and offices. They found more evidence traces of the solvent in the trunk of her SUV, financial records showing unusual cash withdrawals before the fire, and deleted emails on her computer that, when recovered, detailed her increasingly desperate plans to resolve the Valor House issue. They also found clothes hidden in a charity donation bag at the back of her closet, clothes that matched the description of those worn by the disguised woman in the hardware store security footage, faintly smelling of gasoline. The disgruntled landscaper, once assured of federal protection, and seeing the tide turn against his former employer, agreed to provide a full sworn statement and handed over the somewhat damning, if not entirely conclusive, audio recordings of Brenda trying to solicit him for drastic measures. The second shocking event in Brenda's campaign of terror, one that Alex's team uncovered during this phase, was her attempt to frame one of the veterans. She had anonymously tipped off a local tabloid journalist, known for his sensationalist stories, that the fire might have been started by a disturbed veteran from Valor House itself, perhaps in a PTSD-induced episode or as an insurance scam. She had even provided the name of a younger veteran who had had some minor run-ins with the law in the past, long before his service. This veteran, already traumatized by the fire, had been horrified to see veiled accusations appearing online. It was a despicable attempt to deflect blame and further demonize the very people she had victimized. Alex made sure this information reached the right channels, further blackening Brenda's already tarnished reputation and strengthening the case for her malice. The climax came not in a courtroom initially, but in a specially convened Oak Haven Town Council emergency public forum. The official agenda was the future of Valor House and community safety. Alex had requested the opportunity to present his office's findings on the fire. The high school auditorium where the forum was held was packed. Veterans from Valor House, led by Frank Washington and David Chen, sat in the front rows, their faces a mixture of anxiety and grim hope. The rest of the town was there, supporters of few remaining Voorhees allies now looking distinctly uncomfortable, and many ordinary citizens shocked and hungry for answers. Brenda Voorhees was also present, compelled by a federal subpoena, sitting with her lawyer looking pale, but attempting an air of defiant composure. Alex Ramsey, in his crisp federal uniform, took the stage. He spoke calmly, methodically, but with an undercurrent of irrefutable authority. He didn't use rhetoric or emotion. He used facts. He presented the enlarged photographs of the arson indicators, the lab reports on the accelerants, the GPS tracking from Brenda's SUV, placing it at the scene, The hardware store footage, the financial trails, the landscaper's testimony, the evidence of her attempts to frame a veteran. He built his case brick by brick until it was an unshakable fortress of evidence. He showed how her public statements of sympathy contrasted with her private actions of malice and obstruction. The fire at Valor House on the night of October 27th. Alex concluded, his voice resonating through the silent auditorium, was not an accident. It was not faulty wiring. It was a deliberately set act of arson designed to destroy the shelter and endanger the lives of its 30 disabled veteran residents. This act was the culmination of a protracted campaign of harassment, intimidation, and obstruction, motivated by a desire to remove Valor House from this community at any cost. Tori, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces in the audience, finally resting on Brenda Voorhees. The evidence overwhelmingly indicates that the architect of this campaign and the perpetrator of this heinous act of arson is Ms. Brenda Voorhees. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. Brenda jumped to her feet, her face contorted with fury and panic. Lies! This is all lies! A conspiracy to ruin me! But Alex wasn't finished. Ms. Voorhees, he said, his voice cutting through her outburst. Based on the evidence gathered in this federal investigation, I have here a warrant for your arrest. He produced the document. As if on cue, two plainclothes federal agents who had been discreetly positioned near the exits moved calmly and purposefully towards Brenda. The auditorium erupted, shouts, gasps, a few scattered supportive cries from the veterans. Brenda Voorhees struggled, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her in public ignominy. Her lawyer tried to intervene, but the agents were impassive and efficient. The click of handcuffs was clearly audible in the sudden hush that followed her removal. Justice, public and undeniable, had arrived. Frank Washington slowly got to his feet, tears streaming down his weathered face, not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming relief. Other veterans rose with him, some embracing others, simply standing in stunned silence as the woman who had tormented them was finally held accountable. The community of Oak Haven watched, grappling with the betrayal by one of their own and the courage of the men and women she had targeted. The falling action unfolded with the grim efficiency of the federal justice system. Brenda Voorhees' bail was set extraordinarily high, and she remained in custody. Her trial was a regional sensation. Faced with the mountain of evidence Alex Ramsey's team had compiled, her expensive lawyers could do little more than attempt to mitigate the damage. She was convicted on multiple federal counts: arson of a property receiving federal assistance, use of fire to commit a federal felony, and several counts of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The judge, a no-nonsense former prosecutor, delivered a scathing indictment of her actions before sentencing her to 15 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole for at least 10. He also imposed massive financial penalties, ordering that a significant portion of her seized assets be directed towards a fund for rebuilding Valor House and compensating the veterans for their trauma and loss. Her carefully curated empire of influence and respectability crumbled into dust. In Oak Haven, the community underwent a period of soul-searching. The shock of Brenda's crimes and the realization of how much silent suffering her victims had endured spurred a genuine desire for atonement and change. The interim town council purged of Voorhees' cronies, publicly apologized to the veterans and David Chen. A new grassroots fundraising campaign for Valor House, Rebuild with Honor, was launched, and this time it received overwhelming support, not just locally, but nationally, as the story of their plight and Brenda's downfall captured public attention. Donations poured in. Architects and builders offered their services pro bono. Alex Ramsey, his job in Oak Haven, largely done, returned to Washington, but he didn't forget Valor House. He used the case with its stark illustration of how vulnerable such shelters could be to lobby Congress for stronger protections and improved safety standards for facilities housing veterans and other at-risk groups. His testimony, clear, factual, and imbued with the moral authority of his position and the visceral reality of the Oak Haven fire, was compelling. The Valor Act, as it became known, was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. It mandated stricter fire safety codes for all federally assisted shelters, increased funding for security upgrades, established clearer protocols for interagency cooperation in investigating crimes against such facilities, and provided grants for community outreach programs designed to combat NIMBYism and foster support for vulnerable populations. The resolution was a story of renewal and enduring impact. Brenda Voorhees disappeared into the federal prison system, her name becoming a byword for arrogance and malice brought to justice. The new Valor House rose from the ashes of the old, not just rebuilt, but reborn. It was a modern, accessible, secure facility designed with input from the veterans themselves. It featured state-of-the-art fire suppression and security systems, comfortable living quarters, enhanced therapy spaces, and beautiful community gardens. Frank Washington, his eyes twinkling with pride, cut the ribbon at the grand opening ceremony, surrounded by his fellow veterans, David Chen, and a visibly supportive Oak Haven community. Many of the townsfolk, who had once been indifferent or silently complicit in Brenda's campaign, now volunteered regularly at the new shelter, their attitudes transformed by the ordeal. Alex Ramsey was an honored guest at the dedication. He rarely attended such events, preferring to remain behind the scenes, but this one was special. He watched as Frank Washington spoke not of bitterness or revenge, but of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. "They tried to burn us down," Frank said, his voice strong and clear, "but they only succeeded in igniting a fire in our hearts, a fire for justice, for community, and for a better future. Valor House is more than a building. It's a promise that those who serve will always have a place to call home, a place of safety and respect." The Valor Act, implemented nationwide, began to show tangible results. Shelters became safer, communities became more engaged, and a new standard of care and security for vulnerable populations was established. Alex knew that no law could ever entirely eliminate hatred or malice, but it could create systems that protected the innocent and held perpetrators accountable. The Oak Haven fire, a terrible act of destruction, had, through the convoluted pathways of justice and human response, become a catalyst for profound and positive change, a change that would benefit countless individuals for years to come. As the sun set over the new Valor House, casting a warm glow on the faces of its residents and their supporters, Alex felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The flames of hatred had been extinguished, replaced by the enduring light of hope and the quiet strength of a community that had learned the hard way the true meaning of valor.